Welcome back to the Grad-Centric Podcast. I'm Jason Anderson with Grad Metrics. Today, I'm going to answer a question that I had received in the last week or so, and it's an important question as we start to think about financial aid. We're about ready to go into the financial aid time period where many families are going to start receiving financial aid packages from colleges, either in the mail or more likely online. Many of those are delivered online nowadays. So what is that question? The question is in-state tuition rates. And I get this question from families that their student is going off to a state college. So maybe they live in Missouri and they're going off to the University of Arizona. And the question is, can my student gain residency in order to qualify for in-state tuition? So the answer to that question is it depends. And it really depends state to state and school to school. And the best way to find out the requirements from any given school on this topic is just to use Google, as you might imagine. Just Google the name of the college and residency requirements, and you will tend to find on the school's webpage some information about this topic. Some states it's easier to gain residency, in other states it's not. And the reason why that is because if you know the difference between different types of schools, it starts to make sense as to why there are in-state tuition rates and out-of-state tuition rates. So there are two main types of colleges. There are private schools and public schools. And if you're confused, you're like, hey, I don't know what school is which. Actually, the best way to find out that information is Wikipedia. So we talk about Google and Wikipedia in this podcast episode, but they're really the best resources. So if you look up a school, and most have Wikipedia pages, I mean, most of the schools out there are going to have a presence on this website. You can look at the little banner on the side that has summary information. And one of those topics is, or one of those categories is going to be type. And it will say, private research institution, or it will maybe say public. And sometimes you'll even find a school that is a for-profit institution, which tends to be surprising to most individuals. They don't even realize that. You look at a school like the University of Phoenix or DeVry University, those are public, and sometimes are even traded on the stock exchange. Most universities, though, especially those that we know of, like the University of Missouri, and I'm just going to name some here in my local area, like a Park University or Rockhurst University. These are nonprofit institutions. And so they don't really exist to gain profit for shareholders. They exist for some type of public good or giving back in terms of charity. Now, it may not feel like charity when you look at the tuition rates, but that's the general idea behind why these schools were established. So back to in-state tuition, if you figure out a school that's on your list as a public university, the reason why it's going to have in-state and out-of-state tuition rates is because, at least historically, these state institutions have been funded by the state in which they reside, or sometimes also getting some money from the federal government, but they tend to be government funded. And as such, in tending to be funded at the state level in particular, they like to reserve the right to go to that school at a lower rate for residents of that state. And this makes sense because who are the individuals that are approving in-state tuition rates or approving funding to these schools? Well, it's the legislators. And so the legislators, if they're going to be giving state tax dollars to continue to fund their public institutions that reside within that state, they want to make sure that that money flows through to the citizens of that state. And so in-state tuition is a way to incentivize the residents of that state to attend public institutions and hopefully stay there and contribute to the economy, whereas they're trying to disincentivize out-of-state residents from coming to that school. Or if they do decide to come to that school, they're paying a higher rate. So they're essentially subsidizing that school by saying, hey, I'd rather go to the University of Kansas or Kansas State University. Again, I'm using schools that are here in my local area rather than going to my home university, University of Arizona, whatever that looks like. So another question that I would kind of tag on to this that maybe parents don't know to ask is, are there better ways to qualify for in-state tuition, or maybe even easier ways? Okay, easy is good. And so the answer to that is yes. There are easier ways to get in-state tuition in many cases. What are those ways? Well, a common way is if your student has some type of merit. So high GPA, high standardized test scores, maybe a high class rank. If you, in many schools, if you're qualifying very highly in those categories, you might qualify for what's called an out-of-state tuition waiver or an in-state tuition waiver. So you will essentially, or an out-of-state tuition waiver. So you'll essentially get in-state tuition, just like another resident would, a resident of that state. Another way to do this is to have some type of affiliation. So actually, I wrote a blog post and I posted that at gradmetrics.com. And you can read this, but one good example of this is the Midwest Student Exchange Program. So the Midwest Student Exchange Program gives discounts for tuition in a number of different schools across the Midwest, even though you may not live in that state. So that's another way to get in-state tuition. Then finally, I would say in areas like mine, where I live in the Kansas City area metro, the Kansas City area metro spans across 2 different states. And so you actually see some state schools that are maybe in Missouri, but in the metro, offering an in-state rate for all the individuals in the metro. So that's another way to maybe get a discount on tuition. One other thing that I would say before I end this episode, I tend to keep these episodes pretty short, excuse me, is that be aware that even if you get an in-state tuition waiver, it may not be the best financial deal for you. Why is that the case? So think about it. If you were to go to your local in-state school, you're going to get in-state tuition, and you might also get some additional scholarships to go there. And many in-state schools do that type of thing. So maybe you're going to get in-state tuition, but then you're going to get another $5,000, $10,000 a year, whatever that looks like. Well, if you're an out-of-state person going to an in-state school, a lot of those families, if they get an out-of-state tuition waiver, so they're paying in-state rates, will be very excited about that. But guess what? They're paying the full price of the school. So if they were a resident of that state and maybe qualifying for additional scholarships beyond just in-state tuition or having that option within their own state, they're going to still end up paying significantly more money. And at in-state tuition rates, it's not uncommon to see state schools be north of $100,000 for 4 years living on campus, and sometimes way more than that. So it is still a significant investment, and you still need to gauge whether it's a good financial deal for you, even if you get that in-state tuition waiver. So hopefully that's been helpful. I've interrupted kind of our normal discussion of student loans to bring you this topic, and I hope it was helpful. And we will get back to some of the student loan topics as we continue that series on the Grad Centric podcast.